So for those of you who have a problem with privacy, please ensure that your video is stopped and your name doesn't appear. And it's just started, I believe. We intend the meeting to last for about an hour and a half. Noru will speak for roughly 50 minutes, and we will then throw it open to questions. We're going to keep everyone except the speakers muted during the event. We'll accept questions during the event via the Zoom chat facility. Those of you who are familiar with our work will know that our main focus in normal times is local campaigning. We obviously couldn't do much of that during the lockdowns, but we're delighted that things are back to normal and we can resume our presence in the area. I don't want to take up time on this now, as we're looking forward to hearing our speaker. So I'll say more about our forthcoming activities at the end of the session. Tonight, we are delighted to host our speaker, Noru Tsalic. Noru is Jewish by identity, Israeli by nationality, Romanian by birth, and British by current residence. A former IDF soldier, an ardent Zionist, he serves as UK envoy for the Israeli organization Reservists on Duty. As a political commentator, Noru writes for the Times of Israel and Politically Incorrect Politics. His articles have been translated and published. Please tell us more about that, Noru. His articles have been translated and published in Hebrew, French, and Polish. He is a regular Limud UK presenter and was also invited to speak at Limud Midlands, Scotland, Bulgaria, and Mexico. This evening, Noru will be telling us about the Israeli views about the war in the Ukraine. So it's with great pleasure and interest that I now hand over the floor to Noru.
Please unmute.
Thank you very much, Angela. Thank you, Harry, for inviting me. You set very high expectations now. You set me up for failure, but I'll try not to disappoint you. Let me just share my screen. Okay. If anyone doesn't see the beginning of the presentation, then please make some noise. Otherwise, I will continue. You know, Angela, you asked me to tell you some more about the Times of Israel and politically incorrect politics, and your wish is my command. So that's how I'm going to start. So what you're going to hear tonight is a very shortened version of a series of 5 articles that I published on the Times of Israel. If you want to read it there, if you find this interesting and you want to learn more, then you can just Google my name and you'll find my articles on the Times of Israel website. Otherwise, you can read them on my blog, which is entitled indeed Politically Incorrect Politics. I understand that that is funny, which is good. And this is the link that takes you to that blog. You can take a picture with your phone if you wish. Anyway, so that's now I have to start by saying what you're going to hear are my personal views and opinions. I'm not here to represent the state of Israel. I'm no official capacity. I can't represent its institutions or any institution at all. Okay, that's important for me to say from the beginning. You know, I've entitled this presentation An Israeli View, because there is no one Israeli view, of course. The Israelis, like everybody, you know, have various views, but by and large, I think we tend to sympathize with Ukraine as the victim in this conflict and as the underdog. But this is by no means, by no means a consensus. Don't forget that many Israelis originate from the former Soviet Union, and they are themselves bitterly divided. Some of them love Putin, believe it or not, and others hate him. Now, Israelis in general are sensitive to history. You know, we are conscious of Jewish history, we're driven by history. And also, like everybody, I guess, we tend to look at events through the prism of our own selfish interests, except that, you know, Israelis tend to view some of those interests as critical, even existential. And one of those interests is we need reasonable relations with Russia. And that's because, of course, Israel is a US ally, is a Western ally, but, you know, the US is out there somewhere. It's withdrawn from the Middle East in Obama, under Obama, in Obama times, while Russia is very much there. We have Russian soldiers on our borders, practically, you know, in Syria. Russian, you know, people who operate anti-aircraft rockets and pilots, airplane pilots, and so on. And we managed to somehow forge an interesting and valuable and delicate relationship with the Russians, in the sense that we are bombing and killing their allies, and they turn a blind eye. They don't intervene, they don't fight with us. And that is very important for us. Now, I mentioned something about history. Jews have a complicated relationship historically with both Russia and Ukraine. You know, the massacres led by Khmelnytsky in Ukraine are among the bloodiest episodes in our history, and it's not an easy history, as you know. There were pogroms in both Russia and Ukraine, including in the 20th century. And there was, of course, especially in Ukraine, there was collaboration with the Nazis, including in the killing of Jews, including at Babi Yar, for instance. So quite a lot of historical ballast there, but it's not just history, it's even more the way currently Ukrainians relate to that history. The fact that they, you know, celebrate Bogdan Khmelnytsky. They consider Bogdan Khmelnytsky a great Ukrainian leader. We, of course, see that man as, you know, the leader of bands that killed and raped, mass raped Jews. And there is also celebration of arguably nationalistic Ukrainian leaders who collaborated with the Nazis. We don't like that, of course. And so, you know, we do see Ukrainians as victims, but we're aware that they're not angels either. By the way, there are ultra-nationalist militias were established in Ukraine. Some would say fascist militia. especially the notorious Azov battalion. We call them battalion, it's a regiment actually, they've enlarged it. It's a regiment these days. And very importantly, it's not that there are, you know, kind of fringe militias, but these militias have been integrated into the armed forces of Ukraine. So some of these people actually draw a salary from the Ukrainian state. Now, one of the things, with all that in mind, one of the things that one of the many things that bother me about this conflict is that in the West, we tend to hear one narrative and one narrative only. You know, you listen to any mainstream politician, you listen to the mainstream media, you hear one narrative. This bothers me. I think in democracy we should have a diversity of opinions. It bothers me that I open the Telegraph and I open the Guardian and I read almost the exact same story. And I think we hear a lot of myths and a lot of partial truths and some outright lies. For instance, the attitude is in the media, among the politicians, that Ukraine and the West, are completely and utterly on the side of the good, on all this. Now, it's true that in the current conflict, there is one culprit, Vladimir Putin. This guy is a power-hungry bully. He's a dictator, and quite frankly, he's a criminal. He was a criminal before the war started, and he's only compounding his crimes. But that doesn't mean that the Ukrainians are completely innocent. Looking at the bigger picture, not just today in today's conflict, but in the bigger picture, that doesn't mean that the Western leaders have not made many critical mistakes that brought us to where we are today to a certain extent. And for instance, I've written here that the West facilitated, encouraged, helped, in a sense, Putin rise to power. I want to explain what I mean by that. Let's try to compare what happened after the First World War and after the Second World War. After the First World War, the victors at the time, mainly Britain and France, imposed very, very humiliating conditions on Germany. Not just humiliating, but catastrophic from an economic point of view. They drove Germany into sheer poverty. And that led to social dissatisfaction and social unrest. And that led to the rise of all kinds of extremist ideologies, mainly, of course, Nazis. And we know what happened. Hitler's rise to power. Hitler was a nobody, okay? It's the situation in Germany at the time, this poverty, unemployment, and so on, that and the national humiliation that helped him come to power. Now, after World War II, the victors, the Allies, especially the USA, which was in the leadership position, did not repeat those mistakes. Not necessarily out of generosity, but out of interest, but it doesn't matter. In reality, they helped Germany recover. They pumped money into Germany through the Marshall Plan. And as a result of that, there was some degree of economic affluence, social stability, and that led to what we have today, a democratic, liberal Germany, and a peaceful Germany. I mean, compare these two pictures, the children fed with charity food. And here the poster says the emergency program of Berlin with the help of the Marshall Plan. Now, after the Second World War, there was another war. There was another war, the Cold War, which the West won, hands down. The Soviet Union disintegrated into nation states. Not just that, but those nation states abandoned completely the communist ideology. They sought to embrace capitalism, to embrace market economy. But of course, transitioning from Marxism, Leninism to, private property and a private sector economy and a free market economy wasn't going to be easy. And Russia experienced abject poverty. Generals worked as taxi drivers, colonels worked as stevedores, and great scholars and artists cleaned the streets. Something like that. But more importantly, ordinary Russians struggled to put bread on the table, struggled to provide a roof over their children's heads. And, they felt a kind of national humiliation. We know that poverty it's not just the physical aspects of poverty, it's the psychological aspects, the feeling of worthlessness and so on that these people you see here would have experienced. Now, if at that moment the West would have instituted a new kind of Marshall Plan, I'm convinced that Russia would be today firmly ensconced among the free world and so on. But that's not what happened. The West could have done that. We're talking 1990s. The West was rich, but it showed complete indifference. It turned its back on the whole thing, and that helped Putin come to power. Just like Hitler, he was brought to power, he was made popular because the Russians perceive him as dragging them out of poverty, and very importantly, perhaps more importantly, as restoring their dignity, their national dignity. But the West did something else as well. It expanded the NATO military alliance. Of course, the expansion started during the Cold War. That's understandable. We had a kind of war going on. But in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, these countries in Eastern and Central Europe that were members in the Warsaw Pact, were satellites of the Soviet Union, they became neutral countries. But what NATO did, it integrated these countries, it absorbed these countries as members of NATO. And by doing that, it actually expanded eastwards towards Russia, and only eastwards. NATO did not expand in any other direction. It only expanded eastwards towards Russia. And it's supposed to continue to expand through the absorption of Sweden and Finland. Now, of course, Putin suffers from paranoia, I'm convinced, like any dictator. But, even a reasonable Russian leader, it's not unreasonable to ask, why is NATO expanding towards us? Why is it advancing towards us all the time, and only towards us? And it's not unreasonable for us to ask whether this policy was the right policy, because once Russia abandoned communism, it didn't seek anymore to impose that ideology on the entire world. What then was the reason that we still regarding Russia as an enemy? Why? Now, remember also that, I'm going to go back actually, remember also that NATO, that some other countries wanted to join NATO, Ukraine and also Georgia, okay, that are really close to Russia. And NATO did not integrate Ukraine and Georgia as members, but it kind of flirted with the idea, okay? It flirted with the idea, it attracted those countries, but once those countries got in trouble with Russia, it kind of abandoned them. At least we can say it did not defend them militarily, okay? And not just that, in fact. It's not just that we didn't defend them, but in reality, we told the Russians from the beginning, we're not going to get involved militarily. You see, this is the Deputy Secretary General of NATO stating publicly that NATO will not get involved militarily in Ukraine. And when does he do that? At the beginning of February, okay, before the Russian invasion. It's almost like we provided Putin with reassurance that, you know, don't worry, we're not going to get involved. We're not going to try to defend Ukraine. Do your worst. Now, I'm not saying, you know, there are probably good reasons why we wouldn't want a war with the Russians, but did we really have to provide this reassurance before it even started? We are being told, I've taken this from the BBC actually, this bit, NATO will not intervene militarily because Ukraine is not a NATO member. That's, I'm sorry, but that's sand thrown in our eyes. First of all, NATO did intervene militarily in non-member countries. Remember former Yugoslavia, remember Afghanistan, for instance. And also, this is setting the reality on its head. The reality is that Ukraine wanted to be a NATO member. It wasn't allowed to become a NATO member because NATO did not want the responsibility of defending it. So you know, the cause and effect are reversed here. But speaking from a legal point of view, and forget ethics, you know, what is moral. If we look at legalities only, then NATO was not obligated to intervene in Ukraine. It's true, Ukraine is not a member state, and therefore we're not obliged to defend it. But what is not being said, or is not being said enough, is that USA, not NATO, but USA and arguably UK were legally obligated to defend Ukraine. And let me explain why. In 1990, when Ukraine gained its independence, it had on its territory the third largest nuclear arsenal in the entire world. United States, Russia, and Ukraine, okay? These were bombs and rockets that had been installed there by the Soviet Union, but they were on Ukrainian sovereign territory. Ukrainian was in possession of those weapons. Ukraine did not want those weapons. And so they signed a series of agreements with Russia and USA. One of those agreements was signed with the UK as well. And through those agreements, Ukraine agreed to renounce those weapons, to send them to Russia, which is what they did, in return for security guarantees. Okay, those agreements, legal agreements, international agreements, contained guarantees for Ukraine's safety, for its territorial integrity, for its political independence. I don't have to tell you that Russia brutally and cynically violated those commitments. But the truth is that USA, and arguably the UK as well, failed to fulfill their part in that deal, failed to defend Ukraine as they had committed to do. So to me, that reminds me of what was done to Czechoslovakia in 1938. Czechoslovakia also had guarantees from Britain and France, but when it, when it was threatened by the Nazis, it was abandoned. This is not exactly the same thing, but there are some similarities. And we Israelis, we look at this and we say, well, and we think, well, what if it were us? Would anyone come to our defense if we need it? Certainly not. Now, reading sometimes what the politicians say, what the media says, we might think that Ukraine is some sort of, paradise, but it isn't actually. The Freedom House ranks the country as partly free, that's somewhere in between a dictatorship and a democracy, not a democracy, with a relatively low, quite a low score, 61 out of 100. Just to provide some references, Hungary is accused by liberals of sliding into fascism. Well, Hungary has a higher score than Ukraine. Not to mention Israel. Israel is accused of apartheid, no less. Israel has a much higher score and is ranked as free, as a democratic country. One of Ukraine's problems, arguably one of its biggest problems, is that it has an internal ethnic conflict. Ukraine is home, of course, to the Ukrainian people, but also to a large Russian minority, ethnic Russian minority. And this has, as usual, this is down to historical reasons. Ukraine was allocated territories in a sort of careless, haphazard way, with no regard of who was living there. For instance, Russia gifted Ukraine the Crimea Peninsula in 1954, although that area was inhabited by other people. The Ukrainians were a small minority in Crimea. And also, parts of Ukraine were depopulated through famine caused by the Soviet regime, and other parts, or the same parts, sometimes were repopulated with Russian settlers. You know, if they were Jews, they would be called illegal settlers, but that expression isn't used about the Russians. There were also Russification policies. I don't want to go too deeply into this, but the upshot of all that is this, okay? In the western part of Ukraine, most people speak the Ukrainian language, while in the east and in the south, most people speak Russian. So you've got this internal conflict. And sorry, okay. The Ukrainian governments, most of them, not all of them, but most of them since independence, have led nationalist policies, the so-called Ukrainization, which is the preferential promotion of the Ukrainian language and culture, in a sense, against the Russian language and culture. For instance, there were a number of laws adopted by Ukraine which regulated the use of language, which language should be used in various instances. The most recent such law regulates education, for instance, and media. So in reality, in practice, it bans Russian from schools. It bans Russian from universities, from the education sector. And in practice, it also makes it impractical for Russian to be used by the media. To the point where, the BBC actually called it a ban on the Russian language. It's always, it's a good indication always to look at road signs. Road signs in Ukraine, if you travel to Wales in this country, well, not in this country, in Wales, if you travel to Wales, you'll see the road signs are written in English and Welsh. But in Ukraine, the road signs are written only in Ukraine. This may look like Russian, but it's not, it's Ukraine. This letter here does not exist in Russian. This reads Kharkiv as opposed to Kharkov, as Russians would say or write. And now what's wrong with that? What's wrong with promoting Ukrainian? Well, 1 in 3 Ukrainian citizens has Russian as his or her mother tongue. Imagine for one moment that Israel would legislate, would pass a law forbidding Arabic from schools. So Israeli Arab children cannot now be taught in Arabic. They have to be taught in Hebrew and only in Hebrew. That would cause an outrage. But when Ukraine did that, of course, Israel didn't do that, never thought of doing that. But when Ukraine did exactly that, the liberals in the West remained pretty much silent. They didn't make a big deal out of it. The east of the country, especially this area, the Donbass, which has a large ethnic Russian population or high concentration of ethnic Russian population, they wanted Ukraine to look otherwise. They wanted some autonomy. They certainly wanted to continue to use Russian as their main language because that's what their parents spoke to them and so on and so forth. Now, rather than trying to reach some sort of accommodation, the Ukrainian government ignored them, and imposed this Ukrainization upon them. Of course, it's not just that. Russia also got involved, Putin poured fuel on the fire, and the result was ethnic conflict, to the point where people, not just came to blows one with another, but actually shot each other and stabbed each other. And the West kind of stayed on the sidelines here. They did not express real criticism. They supported, by and large, the Ukrainian government. And that helped Putin. Putin took advantage. He exploited this conflict to advance his own aims. Another myth that we are being told, we're being told often that Russia's economy is in trouble. It's crumbling. It's going to collapse under the weight of those extreme sanctions that we adopted. Now, first of all, I don't think, and ask me otherwise if you want to know why, but I don't think that sanctions work in terms of changing the politics of a country or the policies of a country. And I don't think that the sanctions that we adopted against Russia are extreme in any sense. I don't think so. But apart from what I think, the fact is that that's a misrepresentation of the reality. You know, back in March, the press told us rather gleefully that the Russian currency, the ruble, collapsed. And it did. But what they failed to tell us with the same intensity is what happened afterwards. Because yes, the currency collapsed at some point, but then it recovered rather rapidly and is now stronger than before the war started. Why this is happening? Well, again, ask me, I can tell you later why I think it's happening. But the fact is that the European Union continues to provide money to Putin to the tune of 1 billion euros a day. And the unpleasant truth, you know, an unpleasant truth is still a truth. And the unpleasant truth is that Russia's economy is pretty much fine, thank you. And in fact, their revenues are higher than ever because the prices of oil and gas have increased. We're also, it's being implied by some politicians sometimes. This is Putin's war. The ordinary Russians, of course, oppose this. Folks, I'm sorry, but that's not true. Some Russians, of course, oppose it. You know, people have different ideas, but the majority of Russians, I'm afraid, support the war. Putin is very popular in Russia. It may be hard to understand for us why, but he is very popular in Russia. That's the reality. It's also not true, as sometimes it's being implied, that Ukrainians are all united in opposition, you know, heroically in opposition to the Russian aggression. Of course, many Ukrainians are ready to give their own lives in defense of their country. But by no means all Ukrainians. You know, there are a lot of Ukrainians who have different ideas, who certainly those Ukrainian citizens that are of Russian ethnicity, many of them would have wanted to see something else, would have wanted to see tighter, warmer, better relationships with Russia. Some politicians also told us that Russia is practically a pariah state, you know, isolated and condemned by the entire world. You know, how are they going to be able to recover ever? That's a distortion of reality. That's not true. Yes, the West sanctions Russia, that much is true, but nobody else does. Most other countries quite happily continue to trade with Russia. Critically, China and India continue to trade with Russia as if nothing happened. And finally, we're being, you know, some people try to persuade us or to persuade themselves perhaps that Ukraine, you know, can win this war, is actually winning this war. Well, if they are winning, that's the strangest win that I ever saw. It's the Russians that conquered Ukrainian territory, not the opposite. And to anyone that you know, has a bit of military knowledge, the situation of Ukraine, the strategic situation and the tactical situation actually is very difficult. Now look at this. The best of Ukrainian army is here in this region, trying to resist the Russian offensive. But look at these pincers, okay? What they threaten to do, the Russians, is to encircle that part of Ukrainian army. And so the Ukrainian army is forced to fight on the flanks as well, which is very difficult. And it's forced to defend quite a long front, which of course benefits the Russians who have the bigger army. Ukrainians can't very well afford to spread their forces so much. And also, the Russians, as you can see, have conquered much of the south of Ukraine, and they are blockaded. The Russian Navy is blockading the shores of Ukraine, which means you can't ship things to Ukraine and you can't ship them out of Ukraine. Of course, you can still transport items over land, but land transportation is expensive. It's much more expensive than shipping. And it's also difficult because there just isn't enough infrastructure. There isn't enough capacity for land transportation, for everything that needs to be shipped there, like weaponry, for instance, and ammunition. Now, what's the end game? Because I anticipate that question. Of course, I don't really know, but I can try and guess for whatever it's worth. And my guess is that Russia, unfortunately, will complete the conquest of the entire Donbass, as well as keeping, the south of the country. They may even push, if they decide that they can without terrible losses, they may decide to push on into the south, taking Mykolaiv and Odessa. These are port cities. This would have two purposes from a Russian point of view. First of all, to ensure a land route to Transnistria. Transnistria is a breakaway republic, so-called. What they did in Ukraine, they did before that in Moldova. These are the Russian, the Russian-speaking minority, the ethnic Russians in Moldova. They established this breakaway statelet with Russian support, and Russia has military forces there, has soldiers there that are currently transported by plane. The Russians would obviously want a land route to this area. They would also want to cut off Ukraine from the sea, to turn it into a landlocked country, which would very much affect its economy and everything. These territories doubtless will be annexed to the Russian Federation. Maybe they'll give some autonomy to the Donbass, but by and large, they will be annexed. And at that point, I think that hostilities will wind down. There may even be a formal ceasefire. And at that point, the EU is going to start applying pressure, not on Putin. They try to apply pressure on Putin without much success. They'll try to pressure Ukraine to, be flexible, make concessions, resolve the dispute through diplomatic means. In reality, Zelensky has already offered certain concessions. But obviously that will start a blame game, inside Ukraine and between Ukraine and the West. And not just that. When something bad happens, you can be sure of one thing, that some people will blame the Jews. It's always been like that. There's a pandemic, some people will blame it on the Jews. There's, war. The Jews are to blame. That's what happens. Let me show you, for instance, the Forbes published the so-called Ultimate Guide to Russian Oligarchs. And that guide starts with 3 people who have identifiable Jewish names. Now, the 4th on that list is German Khan. German Khan isn't, a typical Jewish name, but the man happens to be Jewish. And Forbes wanted its readers to know that. Okay, so they make the point. The 5th guy on the list is a certain Alexei Kuzmichev. This guy isn't Jewish, but he has a Jewish connection. He has Jewish friends. And Forbes wants its readers to know that. So much they want its readers to know that they tell them not once, not twice, 3 times in the course of a short article about this Alexei Kuzmichev guy. They, say that he has Jewish friends. Now, if someone takes the time to go through the entire list, research, then the conclusion is clear. That list does not consist of Jews. In fact, Jews are a minority, a small minority on that list. Most of that list, there are Russians there are Ukrainians, the Belarusians. There are even Muslims on that list, from Uzbekistan, from Tajikistan. But that doesn't interest Forbes. Forbes starts with the Jews. It's important to stress that there are Jews there. Let me make this point because, unfortunately, some of us don't know this. The other day I was speaking with this, elderly Jewish gentleman, and all of a sudden he tells me, well, these Russian oligarchs, most of them are Jews. I'm saying, no, that's not true. Why are you saying this? You fell victim to this deception. Take any list of these oligarchs. This is another list published by another newspaper. There's only a small minority of Jews among a lot of non-Jews. Why say, that, why give ammunition to the anti-Semites? Where the anti-Semites come into their own is when they can accuse the Jewish state, not directly the Jews, the Jewish state. As one Israeli journalist wrote, why is it that so many mainstream journalists are fixated on Israel in relation to a conflict that has nothing to do with Israel? Why? In the Middle East, of course, anti-Semitism is not something people hide at all. This guy, this Houthi leader, is saying it as he thinks it. What's happened in Ukraine is because of the evil doing of the Jews. It's because the country has a Jewish president. If it didn't have a Jewish president, all would be peach. And it's not just him, the interviewer doesn't contradict him. Let this go completely. But make no mistake, this is in the Middle East, but in the West, also a lot of people are quite aware, quite conscious of the fact that Zelensky is Jewish. For some reason, the fact of him being Jewish is suddenly important. Although, he's a Ukrainian citizen, not an Israeli citizen. He's a Ukrainian patriot. Some would say a Ukrainian nationalist. And imagine if at some point Zelensky has to make painful concessions, as part of an arrangement. What will these people say? They'll blame the Jews, of course, just like the Nazis blamed the Jews for Germany losing the First World War. But it doesn't stop there. This is the foreign minister of Ukraine, no less. And he uses what is clearly, in my eyes, anti-Semitic expressions. And of course, the Russian foreign minister, competes with him and wins in my view. He claimed at some point that Hitler was part Jewish. But okay, this is the Russian foreign minister. But look at how the BBC reports this. The news is not, Sergei Lavrov made the outrageous claim that Hitler was part Jewish. No, the news is that Israel is outraged by that. That's the news. Okay, throw Israel into it. In fact, put Israel in the headlines, because that's excellent clickbait. We want to make money by catering to this anti-Semitic sentiment. Now, the only way Israel is connected to this conflict is by trying to mediate. Israel has good relationship with Russia, good relationships with Ukraine, and so the prime minister was asked by the president of Ukraine to try and mediate. The prime minister of Israel is a religious Jew, an observant Jew, a Shomer Shabbat. He wouldn't go into his car to drive 100 meters, but he went onto a plane and flew to Moscow on Shabbat, because as we know, saving lives justifies breaking Shabbat. To the point where the Financial Times, which is not friendly to Israel in any way, said at some point that Bennett has been the primary international mediator. He didn't succeed to make peace, but at least he created a channel of communication. Unfortunately, some people can't even recognize this. They can't see anything good in Israel. Even Jewish groups, there are Jewish groups who tend to be very, very critical of Israel. And that's fine. But my question is, if you are so quick to bash Israel when you don't like what Israel does, and why can't you find it in your heart to say a word of praise when Israel does something obviously positive, obviously good? The Bennett's flight to Moscow became news in most of the media. Even in places like India, they wrote about it, but not the BBC. The BBC was completely silent, ignored the fact completely. They did not ignore other mediators. They reported about the French president trying to mediate, about the Turkish president trying to mediate, but they completely ignored the Israeli prime minister and his flight to Moscow. They ignored it for like 10 days or 2 weeks. This is an eternity in journalistic terms, okay? When they finally, after 10 days, I think, when they finally said something about it, they tried to put a negative flag. Now, for some people, the whole tragedy in Ukraine is just another opportunity to bash Israel. You can see it here, you can see The Guardian. Unfortunately, it's not just journalists, it's also politicians. You know, this lady, Julie Elliott, she's an MP, and this was in a debate in the House of Commons on the 24th February, on the 24th February. Remember, that's the date of the invasion. And that's what the honorable lady had to say about Ukraine, okay? Russia attacked Ukraine, so let's sanction Israel. Of course, Peter Boehner always jumps on these bandwagons. Now, I'm going to stop talking about, you know, from a Jewish perspective, from an Israeli perspective, because what's happened has consequences. You know, it never ends with the Jews. It starts perhaps with the Jews, but it never ends with the Jews. And this has potential consequences for the entire world. I asked someone the other day, you know, tell me, what do these individuals have in common? What do they have in common? And he told me they're all Muslims. I said, no, they were Muslims perhaps, but how can you not see what they have in common is they're all dead. This guy is very much alive. The point isn't that he is a Muslim, the point is that he is alive. Okay, and why is he alive? Arguably he's alive because he has control of nuclear weapons. Okay, this guy wanted to develop nuclear weapons, but he was persuaded not to. And now he's dead. This guy wanted to develop nuclear weapons, but Israel stopped him, and now he's dead. These two guys, fortunately, did not get their hands on nuclear weapons. Ukraine, as I said, had nuclear weapons, but it gave them up. Arguably, if it still had those weapons, it wouldn't have been attacked. So now, if you are one of these individuals, what lesson do you learn from all this? What does this tell you about what nuclear weapons, control of nuclear weapons does in terms of, you know, keeping your regime afloat and keeping you alive? So this is a very, very dangerous lesson that we let these people learn. And also, everybody now is focusing on Ukraine. And when the world is focusing in one place, bad things tend to happen in another place. You know, in January 2003, everybody was looking in one place, in Iraq. Why? Because there was huge tension between USA and Iraq over the issue of weapons of mass destruction, supposedly, and so on. So everybody was looking in that direction. What happened also in January 2003 is that North Korea withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We know where that led, and arguably that, unfortunately, and God forbid, may be more dangerous than whatever happened in Iraq. And what is the lesson that China learns from all this? Okay, China says overtly that Taiwan is part of China, that they will return it to the bosom of the motherland by force if need be. what is the conflict in Ukraine and the Western reaction or lack of Western reaction? What does it tell China? And of course, it's not just about your enemies or potential enemies, it's also about your allies. You know, UAE is a Western ally, is an ally of the United States. But in mid-March, they invited Bashar Assad, who is a Russian ally. They invited him to visit. And this, for anyone who, you know, can read the writing on the wall, the writing is very clear. That was a warning that they gave to the West, saying, look, we don't trust you. You don't treat, you don't defend your friends, you don't stand by your friends, and we're worried. Now, you know, I've been talking, I think, for almost an hour now as an Israeli about conflicts. And I know there will be people who will be saying, but what about the Palestinians? How can you talk for an hour about conflicts and so on and not mention the Palestinians? So I'm going to mention the Palestinians. The conflict in Ukraine can only be bad for the chances of an Israeli-Palestinian negotiated solution. Why? Well, to start with, it's a return to the Cold War situation. And we know what happens in a Cold War. If one side supports Israel, the other side feels compelled to support the Palestinians. And this is not conducive, you know, of making peace. But also, any conceivable agreement will need someone to guarantee it. And international guarantees are so devalued these days because everybody sees that when it comes to the crunch, those guarantees are not worth the paper they are written on. So, to conclude, many Israelis look at this conflict and yes, you know, we see Russian aggression, but that doesn't surprise us. We never thought that Putin was a nice guy. We leave that naivety to the Europeans. We see Ukraine as a victim, but angels, they're not. But we see Western impotence, weakness, indifference, a lot of naivety, and a lot of hypocrisy. And we see kind of testimony or early warning of what may happen if Israel were attacked. At least when it comes to Ukraine, they imposed sanctions on Russia. When the Arab states attacked Israel in 1973, nobody adopted sanctions against them. Quite the opposite. The Arabs sanctioned the West. We see lots of anti-Semitism around this, although Jews are not really involved. Israel isn't really involved. And we see worrying global consequences. And the conclusion is disheartening, that we still are, you know, in a very primitive place. The Romans said it more than 2,000 years ago. Vis pacem para bellum. And, you know, 2,000 years later, we're kind of in the same place. That's not good. I like to finish my presentations on a positive note, but I wasn't able to find much positive in this. I'm sorry. So that's all in terms of what I wanted to say, but I'm more than willing to try and answer questions if there are any. And I'll leave you with again, with this, you know, if you found this interesting and you want to hear more, then read those 5 articles. They're not short, but I hope they're interesting. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noru. Yes, it wasn't an optimistic ending, but it certainly has given us a lot of food for thought. It was far more complicated than any of us realize. So thank you very much. We have got a number of questions. The first one is Russian the first language in I presume, Felix, you mean in those areas?
Yeah, I mean, when you started talking about, how many people spoke Russian, I wasn't sure, because I thought about maybe 30% of Ukrainians speak Russian as a first language. But I think you're saying maybe 2/3 do speak Russian, but I don't know if that's as a first language.
So pretty much all, it's the only way I would, and I'm sorry if I'm using the wrong comparison here, but if you think of Wales, for instance, okay, pretty much everybody speaks English. And also in Ukraine, I believe pretty much everybody speaks Russian, or at least they understand Russian quite well. I'm not so sure about the children, the young generation, because as you've seen, they're being taught only Ukrainian in schools now, so maybe not. But certainly, the vast majority of Ukrainians speak Russian, but about 2/3 of them speak Ukrainian as their first language, as the mother tongue. Okay, and about 30% speak Russian as their mother tongue. And that kind of represents here, it's not exactly the same as ethnicity, and it's also hard to draw an ethnic line between Ukrainians and Russians, perhaps. And the language is a good proxy for that.
So I thought you'd actually said that more people speak Russian. As I was under the impression that it was maybe 2/3, but
it's unequal. In the east of the country and the south of the country, more people speak Russian than Ukrainians as the mother tongue. Okay. And in the west, it's the opposite.
I see. Okay. Apart from Kiev.
Thank you, Noru. Thanks.
Thank you.
Did you have a question, Harry?
No, I'll let the
All right.
I'll let the others.
The next one was from Ashley. If only those former Eastern European, former Soviet satellite nations had become non-aligned and NATO not expanded eastward, would you agree?
Well, we're in the realm of what if. I don't know. I can't answer that question really. But all I'm saying is that it was a problematic step to absorb those countries. Let's from a military point of view, those countries are nothing. Okay. We're talking about countries that don't contribute anything really to the alliance. At least they didn't at that point. Maybe today Poland, is better, but at the time they did not make any real contribution. This is about territory. This is about NATO expanding and getting the possibility to use territory that is closer to Russia. And remember that one of the things that happened years ago that nobody mentions today, but it was quite critical at the time, is that NATO wanted to place certain missile systems in those countries, especially in Poland, in Romania. And we're talking anti-missile or missile interceptors, okay? Now you'd think, well, missile interceptors is a defensive weapon. What is the problem? Well, there is a problem because remember, the peace is guaranteed by this mutual destruction capability, okay? And the moment you place even a defensive weapon that can take out those intercontinental ballistic missiles, you change that equation. You take it off kilter, off balance. Okay, so it's a very delicate balance there.
Thank you. Sarah's question.
Noru, thanks very much for that. I had long had my suspicions that we'd only been getting one side of the story. And also Eastern, the way NATO, I've suspected that NATO was trying to expand eastwards, which was virtually provoking Putin.
Well, the thing is that it expanded only eastwards, okay? If at least it expanded in other directions, then you could kind of justify it. But when it expands only in the direction of the east, which is Russia, it's a bit tricky to justify.
Thank you. We'll have to cut short the discussion because we have one or two other questions. But thank you for that question anyway. Sarah, thank you for your superb presentation, Noru. Sorry, I can't see. It sounds very depressing, though. Given that Russia will prevail, as you describe, and the West has to deal with it, what do you see the best way forward for the parties to get back onto some sort of workable footing?
First of all, thank you very much, Sarah, for the compliment. Really appreciated. I wish I knew. The problem with conflicts, and you know, the Arab-Israeli conflict is a good example of that. Once you get into a conflict situation, there is so much mistrust, so much baggage, so much ballast, that it's very, very difficult to you know, go back to a more stable situation. So I think short of something happening in Russia with, you know, with somebody else coming to power, which I don't really see today, I have to say. Short of that, it's difficult to imagine. I think we're going back in a situation of kind of Cold War. Okay, of course, the European Union is very keen to put this conflict behind it because of the interests in Russian oil and gas and coal, I have to say. But I'm not sure they will be able to do that because it would be a very, very unpopular position. So I don't know how we, I'd like to say something positive, you know, show some bright horizon out there, but I struggle to find it.
Thanks, Noru. We'd all like you to be more optimistic. We're going to have one more question because we are running out of time, and that's from Karen and David. Oh, just lost it. Sorry. Can Israel do more to offer refuge to Ukrainian refugees? Ukrainian Jews, sorry.
To Ukrainian Jews. I think Israel is doing everything it can to, when it comes to, I'm not sure it does everything it can to provide a refuge for Ukrainian non-Jews, for non-Jewish Ukrainians. That isn't the case, I think, although Israel did take a lot of non-Jewish Ukrainians as well. But when it comes to to Ukrainian Jews, and very important, not just the Jews, but their family members who are not always Jewish, okay, in fact, very often they're not Jewish. When it comes to Jews and their family members, Israel goes out of its way to provide safe passage to these people and bring them to Israel. Israel is very keen to have Jewish immigration, and you know, it will willingly take the families as well. No problem with that. I don't think that there is something that we can think of that we're not doing in that.
Thank you, Noru. I'm sorry if anybody else had questions, but we really have run out of time. Again, thank you so much. I think we've all learned a great deal, and it's also very thought-provoking. Thank you again.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. And you know, it was a pleasure. I hope it was a little bit helpful.
It was certainly. Thank you.
Despite, I hope I didn't depress you too much.
I think we kind of suspected that it was depressing, but thank you anyway. As I said at the beginning, we're now back to our North London Friends of Israel are now back to normal activities. We very much hope that as many of you as possible will feel able to get involved. So especially if you live in or around the North London area, please get in touch. We've already, since lockdowns ended, done street stalls in Hampstead, Enfield, Golders Green and High Barnet. Our next one will be in Whetstone on the 25th of June, which is Saturday week. So do join us, we need you. We send out an email usually once a week, giving details of our activities. So please get involved. If you're not already, get on our mailing list and find out how you can help the cause. We're putting up our details. Here we are. Our contact details are here. You can support our online activities as well on Facebook and Twitter, as well as getting involved in the real world. Again, thank you so much, Noru, and thanks to everyone who came for your time, your contributions, your questions, and we look forward to seeing you all very soon. Many thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was great.
Yes, thanks very much. Look, must ask for the recording.
Yeah.